welcome back. In our last segment, we studied as to why Jesus came when he came, when the fullness of time was come. Okay, what it meant, so on and so forth. And today we are going to start with the divisions of the New Testament. There are 5 divisions of the 27 New Testament books. Hey, do you know to recite the 27 books in their order? Shall we try? Well, if you don't know, no worries. We can, during this synopsis, learn the divisions and automatically we can start memorizing. We will remember the books. Okay, let's start. So it starts with the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Acts of the Apostles, the Epistle to the Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon or Philemon to some people, and then Hebrews, James, the Epistle of James, the first Epistle of Peter, the second Epistle of Peter, the first, second, and the third Epistles of John, the Epistle of Jude, and the book of Revelation, 27. Now these 27 New Testament books are divided into 5 sections, not by Suresh, but by scholars. Praise God for that. The first section, the Gospels, consist of the first 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. During our study, we are going to learn as to why God had to use 4 authors to talk about the one story of Jesus. That's fun, that's interesting. That's section number 1. The second section, history, has only one book, the Acts of the Apostle. Okay? The third section is called Pauline epistles, or for some people, Pauline epistles. Why? Because those epistles were written by Paul. Okay? Now you can subdivide them as prison epistles, pastoral epistles, and he wrote to 7 churches. 7 epistles were addressed to churches, and some personal individuals were recipients of his letters. But let's not get into that. Now, how many Pauline epistles are there? 13 or 14. Why or? Because the last epistle, the epistle to the Hebrews, doesn't say that Paul wrote it. We have no internal evidence to prove that this was Paul who wrote it. But people like me, we believe that it was Paul who wrote it. Why? We have further external evidences. The language that it's used and the substance embedded within the book, the way of presentation, etc. But then who cares? It's the Holy Spirit, isn't it? So let's recite all 14. Okay, let's take it for granted that Hebrews was also written by Paul. So let's start this third section with the epistle to the Romans. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Hebrews. So that's 14. Okay. Then comes the fourth group, which is called general epistles. Why are they called general epistles? Because it was not Paul who wrote them, some others. James. James was written by James. Then 1st and 2nd Peter were written by Peter. And 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were written by John. Then the epistle of Jude written by Jude, 7. Then we come to the final 5th group, but only one book. Just like the historical group has one book, the Acts of the Apostle. The final section, the 5th section, has the prophecy section. Prophecy, the book of Revelation. Okay? Now, friends, let's go back to our first group. The Gospels. Why did God have to use 4 different persons to write this one story? And of the 4, only 2 had been disciples of Jesus, Matthew and John. Mark was not a disciple of Jesus. Luke was not. Mark was the nephew of Barnabas. Have you heard the name Barnabas? We get a nice guy in the book of Acts called Barnabas. He sold everything and he gave everything to the church, and then he was instrumental in bringing Saul, who later became Paul, into the ministry. Barnabas was a nice guy. This Mark, who also had a name John, his John Mark, was Barnabas's sister's son. So this Mark used to be a disciple of Peter. So many people believe that Mark received all the information about what he says in the gospel from Peter. So some people would like to call the gospel of Mark the gospel of Peter. Okay, Luke was actually a physician, a doctor, who was a proselyte Jew. He used to be a Greek, but then he had become a Jew long before he became a Christian. And then he became a Christian under the ministry of Paul. He accompanied Paul in many of Paul's ministerial journeys. So it was Luke who wrote the third gospel. Now, why 4 gospels? Now, I will eventually teach or preach perhaps a wonderful message which you will all like, to show why 4 gospels. I have 2 major reasons. One, psychological, and number 2, theological. Now let's not talk about the psychological reason here, and let's not talk about the theological reason too much. Let's not talk about the reasons, but let's just see, because this is a synopsis only. Let's see why these 4 gospels. These 4 gospels show 4 different perspectives of Jesus to 4 different groups of audiences in 4 different ways. Matthew shows Jesus as the Messiah and the King to the Jews. So the Gospel of Matthew is predominantly aimed at the Jews. Okay? So you will find a lot of Jewish expressions, and whatever Jesus did Jewish, you'll find in the book of Matthew. Okay? And whatever Jesus said as the Messiah, as the King, his behavior as a king, you will find in Matthew. Then Mark was actually writing to the Romans the story of Jesus, and that's the shortest gospel, and the Romans would not tarry. They would not spend a lot of time wanting to learn about some guy somewhere who claims to be God or the Son of God. So he is apparently hasty. So it's a quick gospel, a very fast one. Okay? And he was writing to the Romans to show Jesus as the servant. Why? Now, let's talk about that in my other sermon that I'm going to preach. Okay? So Mark shows Jesus to the Romans as the servant. Then comes Luke. Luke addressed his gospel to a guy called Theophilus. Some scholars speculate this Theophilus to be a proselyte Jew who was also a fellow physician. And they say that Luke and Theophilus studied in the medical school together. They were buddies, they were friends, colleagues. Now, we don't know how authentic this is, but then who cares? But then this physician writes his book to the Greeks to show Jesus as the Son of Man. So you would see Jesus' human nature very explicitly demonstrated in the Gospel of Luke. Now that's why, my dear friends, if you watched movies of Jesus, there are many versions of the Jesus movie, right? They usually base the movie on the Gospel of Luke than the other 3. Because Luke contains a lot of information, a lot of the human side of Jesus, so on and so forth. Then comes the 4th Gospel, John. John, just like Matthew, wrote to the Jews, but not to show Jesus as the Messiah or the King, like the way Matthew does, but to show Jesus as the Son of God or even God. Look how he starts. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's starting that. He's not talking about Bethlehem. He's not talking about the star. He's not talking about the Magi. He's not talking about anything else, but he starts in heaven. The Gospel of John starts in heaven, in the beginning. Ooh, just like Genesis 1:1. In the beginning. And then in verse 14, he says, that Word became flesh. Interesting, eh? He has 21 chapters, and yet he chooses to inscribe only 7 miracles of Jesus. There are 8 actually, but the 8th one is in chapter 21. That's after Jesus rose again from the dead. But the miracles that performed before going to the cross were many, thousands. But John chooses only 7. And in those 7 miracles, he is showing the divinity of Jesus. Shall I preach that also soon? The 7 miracles of Jesus in John. Okay, to show who Jesus was. The 7 aspects of the divinity of Jesus as shown in John. Yes, you can await that message also. Okay, if you like to hear my messages. Okay, and then Jesus taught a lot of parables, but not a single parable of Jesus is found in the Gospel of John. Why? Because it's not relevant to John. He's concentrating only on the divinity of Jesus. Okay? The God, the divine side of Jesus, and Jesus as the Son of God. So that is why, to show Jesus as the King and the Messiah to the Jews, Matthew. To show the Romans that Jesus is the servant to the Romans, that's Mark. And to show the Greeks that Jesus is the Son of Man and he is full of his human nature, he was 100% man, that's the Gospel of Luke. And to show that this 100% man is also 100% God, he's the Son of God and he's God, he was the Word, he became flesh. Now that's John, showing the Jews that, this is your God who has come down in flesh. That's why the 4 Gospels. So my dear friends, if you find some apparent contradictions in the Gospels, now usually, as I said, John is not talking about the many miracles of Jesus, many discourses of Jesus, and parables of Jesus. So usually John stays aloof, segregated, separated from the other 3, and therefore Bible scholars call these 3 synoptic gospels. Sun means in Greek 1, optic means seen. So seen as one, seen together, these 3. So when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke together as a synoptic gospel, then you get the synoptic problem. What's that problem? There are certain details that are found in either all 3 Gospels or in 2 of the 3. And when you compare, you will see differences. And some of those differences appear like contradictions. Now that's synoptic problem. But we in Bible colleges teach our students that synoptic problems are not problems at all. Why do they differ and what are the differences, and so on and so forth. So those are the 4 Gospels. Enjoy reading the Gospels, my dear friends. Let's go to the second section. History. The Acts of the Apostles. Now if you read the first couple of verses, you will see that Luke, who wrote the 3rd Gospel, actually wrote the Acts of the Apostles to the same recipient, Theophilus. Okay? So, the Acts of the Apostle is sort of the continuation of the Gospel of Luke. The next time you read the Gospel of Luke and then jump to the Acts. You'll have fun. It's like reading one story all the way from the birth of Jesus all the way to Acts chapter 28, where the Gospel has gone to Rome. Okay? 28 chapters are there in the book of Acts, and Acts is interesting because it starts where Luke lives. In the book of Luke, Jesus takes all the people to Mount Olives for him to ascend. So he let those people see him ascend to heaven. And he ascended to heaven 40 days after he rose again from the dead. And the book of Acts begins on Mount of Olives. Jesus took them there, and then before he ascended, he said a couple of things. Hey, don't leave Jerusalem, remain there. You will be receiving the baptism of fire, and when the Holy Spirit comes on you, you shall be my witnesses. Acts chapter 1, verse 8 is very interesting, okay? Let me just give you an interesting synopsis. Jesus says, when the Spirit comes on you, which happened in Acts chapter 2, right? You shall be my witnesses. Where? In Jerusalem. Look at the order. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the utmost parts of the earth. Now, if you look at how the gospel spread in the book of Acts, you will see this order. Okay? They were supposed to remain in Jerusalem, which they did. And the Spirit of God fell on them when they were in Jerusalem, in the upper room. Remember Acts chapter 2? And Peter starts to preach the first sermon there in Acts chapter 2, based on Joel chapter 2. So the first Christian sermon was preached in Jerusalem. About 3,000 people got saved and baptized. And the church started. The church started in Jerusalem. The first baptism, the Christian baptism, happened in Jerusalem. Okay? And then, if you look at the book of Acts, and if you go to Acts chapter 6, you'll see that when the disciples grew, there were some problems, mealtime problems between the Grecian Christians and the Jewish Christians. And then 7 deacons were appointed. Now, I don't know how in your church they interpret the word deacon, how you see the ministry of a deacon is, but diakonoia means a slave. It's another word for doulos, okay? So that's somebody who is like a servant. Now, I don't know whether your deacons are servants or bosses. Now, that's up to you. Let's not get into those things here. 7 deacons were appointed, one of who was a guy called Philip. Now, don't confuse the 2 Philips. There was a disciple of Jesus who was also a Philip. But then one of the deacons of Acts chapter 6 was also Philip. Now, this guy, the church grows into Judea, and this Philip goes to Samaria. So the church starts in Jerusalem and grows and expands into Judea, which is the immediate vicinity of Jerusalem. And then the gospel goes from Judea into Samaria with Philip. When Philip was there, God suddenly told Philip one day, hey, now you better get up and run to the south. You go all the way to the southern tip of Israel, Beersheba, and then continue into the Negev, and you'll find somebody. Who is that somebody? That somebody was an Ethiopian minister, a eunuch. In those days, in palaces, you get eunuchs as very high officials. Now, there was this Ethiopian eunuch. He must have been a Jew because he came to Jerusalem, stayed there for some time for the Jewish religious purposes. And then he was returning, and on his return, he was reading the book of Isaiah. Obviously, he was a Jew. And Philip runs alongside the chariot, and he asks this Ethiopian eunuch, excuse me, sir, do you understand what you're reading? And the Ethiopian guy says, well, no, not really. If nobody explains to me, how can I explain? Then Philip says, can I explain? Then the Ethiopian guy says, come on up here. Sit with me and explain. And then Philip preaches the gospel to this Ethiopian guy. And that guy gets saved. And he says, all of a sudden they come to a place where there is water. And then this Ethiopian guy asks Philip, there is water. Is there any obstacle for me to be baptized? Philip says, no, come. And then Philip baptizes this guy, and then the Spirit of God takes Philip away, and that guy very happily goes to Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian guy, he comes from the utmost parts of the earth. Remember Esther 1:1, from India to Cush, India to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia was the utmost part of the earth. So the gospel goes to the utmost parts of the earth from a guy who came from Samaria. Interesting, right? Now this man, the Ethiopian eunuch, was in Jerusalem all these days. He was visiting Jerusalem. I don't know for how many days, but for however many days he was in Jerusalem. And who were there in Jerusalem? The apostles, even the apostles who were disciples of Jesus. This Philip was just a deacon, whereas in Jerusalem there were real apostles, powerful guys. So God could have used one of those powerful guys to preach the gospel to the Ethiopian guy whilst he was in Jerusalem. But what Jesus said in Acts 1:8 is not only spiritual, but it's also literal. Jesus said, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the utmost parts of the earth. So in the book of Acts, you'll see this beautiful order in which the gospel expanded. Wow, interesting, isn't it? These tiny little nitty bits that we don't usually see. So the church starts in Jerusalem, grows in Jerusalem, expands in Jerusalem, then it expands into Judea, and then Philip goes to Samaria. So from Judea to Samaria, and then from Samaria to Ethiopia. Ooh, amazing. And then you will see in the book of Acts how Saul, the persecutor of the church, converts to become a servant of Jesus, who becomes Paul. And then the Pauline ministries, he undertook 3 missionary journeys. He went from one place to another. It's all there in the book of Acts. And then finally, in his 4th journey, he goes to Rome. And in chapter 28, the last chapter, the gospel reaches Rome, and Paul is there. And he started preaching the gospel there for 2 years. Now that's how the book of Acts ends. So there you will see how Peter was used by God, and how the church in Jerusalem was strengthened, and some bleak things also happened. Stephen was martyred, stoned to death, and James was beheaded. So you will see the ups and downs, the persecutions and the revolutions of the gospel. The problems, people like Ananias and Sapphira being judged immediately in the church for lying to God and deception. But then you'll see the grace of God, and you'll see historical, and yet you'll get a lot of spiritual insight. You'll get a lot of theological insight and stuff like that. The book of Acts, 28 chapters, very interesting. Read the history. But it's not just a regular history. It's the history of the church as to how it started in Jerusalem and how it went all the way to Rome. Now, Rome was the world capital. Now, if you have a business that you want to expand into your entire nation, your business has to be stationed in your capital, right? You can't have your business headquarters way out there in the village and expect you to grow and expand. You need to be in the capital. So in those days when the Romans were ruling the world, the world capital was Rome. So by Acts chapter 28, you see Christianity in Rome. Starting Christianity in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, all the way to Ethiopia. And in the end, it is there in Rome. So my dear friends, enjoy the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts. And as I suggested, read Luke and then Acts of the Apostles, because Acts is the continuation of Luke. Next time, let me meet you with the Pauline or Pauline epistles. Until then, may God bless you.